Transatlantic slave trade. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, the transatlantic slave trade occurred, and it involved the forced capture and transportation of millions of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to America, where they were enslaved. This trade involved European powers and their colonies, particularly in America, where these enslaved Africans were used for labor on plantations and in other industries. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe and let's dive in. Today, this video discusses transatlantic slavery. Some viewers may find this topic challenging or sensitive, so we believe in converting this chapter of human history to learn from past mistakes. The Atlantic slave trade is usually separated into two periods, referred to as the First and Second Atlantic systems. During the years 1525 to 1600, only a little over 3% of the enslaved individuals exported from Africa were traded, while 16% were traded in the 17th century. Over the period of the Atlantic slave trade, 12.5 million captured men, women and children were put on ships in Africa, but 10.7 million arrived in the Americas. Who was the first English slave trader? John Hawkins, from 1532 to 1595 of Plymouth, was acknowledged as the pioneer of the English slave trade. In 1562, Yoha Hawkins seized Africans from present-day Sierra Leone and transported 300 individuals to be sold in the Caribbean. He repeated this action in 1564, using the ship Jesus of Lubeck, which belonged to Queen Elizabeth. The Atlantic slave trade, or transatlantic slave trade, involved the transportation by slave traders of enslaved African people, mainly to the Americas. The slave trade regularly used the triangular trade route and its middle passage, and existed from the 16th to the 19th centuries. European ships first sailed to Africa with goods such as textiles, firearms, and alcohol, which they exchanged for enslaved Africans. These captives were then transported across the Middle Passage to the Americas, where they were sold as slaves. In the Americas, the ships loaded up on raw materials like sugar, tobacco, cotton, and rum, before returning to Europe to complete the triangular trade. The vast majority of those who were transported in the transatlantic slave trade were people from Central and West Africa who had been sold by West African slave traders to mainly Portuguese, British, Spanish, Dutch, and French slave traders, while others had been captured directly by the slave traders in coastal raids. European slave traders gathered and imprisoned the enslaved at forts on the African coast and then brought them to America. Except for the Portuguese, European slave traders generally did not participate in the raids because the life expectancy for Europeans in sub-Saharan Africa was less than 1 year during the period of the slave trade. The colonial South Atlantic and Caribbean economies were particularly dependent on labor for the production of sugarcane and other commodities. The Portuguese in the 16th century were the first to buy slaves from West African slaves and transport them across the Atlantic. In 1526, they completed the first transatlantic slave voyage to Brazil, and other Europeans soon followed. Shipowners regarded the slaves as cargo to be transported to America as quickly and cheaply as possible, there to be sold to work on coffee, tobacco, cocoa, sugar, and cotton plantations, gold and silver mines, rice fields, the construction industry, cutting timber for ships, as skilled labor, and as domestic servants. The first enslaved Africans sent to the English colonies were classified as indentured servants, with legal standing similar to that of contract-based workers coming from Britain and Ireland. However, by the middle of the 17th century, slavery had hardened as a radical caste, with African slaves and their future offspring being legally the property of their owners, as children born to slave mothers were also slaves. As property, the people were considered merchandise or units of labor and were sold at markets with other goods and services. Such companies operated in major ports to construct, finance, insure, and organize slave ships and their cargoes. The profits generated from the Atlantic trade economically and politically transformed Liverpool and Bristol in England, Nantes and Bordeaux in France, Lisbon in Portugal, Rio de Janeiro and Salvador de Bahia in Brazil, and Newport, Rhode Island in the United States. Each port developed links to a wide hinterland for local and international goods in Asia and capital to sustain the trade in African captives. These slaves were managed by a factory which was established on or near the coast to expedite the shipping of slaves to the New World. Slaves were imprisoned in a factory while awaiting shipment. Current estimates are that about 12 million to 12.8 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic over a span of 400 years. The ships had a particular design and varied in size and passenger capacity. The conditions of these ships were inhumane. The African slaves were locked up below the deck in cramped quarters and only had a little opportunity to be out in the sunlight. The captives were packed tightly in tiers below decks, and we were chained together hands and feet. They were forced to carry out certain enforced exercises, the form of dancing to ensure that they were healthy and in good posture when they got to Europe. Inside of these decks was sticky and filled with the stench of dirt stool and urine. Research published in 1794 estimated that a man inside the deck had just a space of 6 feet by 1 foot, 4 feet by 1 foot for a woman, and a girl had 4 feet 6 inches by 1 foot. The air inside the deck was hot, stale, and filled with the incessant smell of dirt and human excreta. The slaves endured hunger and thirst, receiving only 24 ounces of water per day. It is equivalent to 2 12-ounce soda cans of fluid per day. Their major food was horse beans and rice. As well, they were forced to live in extremely overcrowded and deplorable conditions, leading to sickness and death. The Middle Passage refers to the grueling and horrific voyage across the Atlantic Ocean that enslaved Africans endured. Many of them suffered unimaginable conditions, such as overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, malnutrition, physical and sexual abuse, and disease-resulting high mortality rate. It is estimated that millions of Africans died during this part of the journey. The possibility of mutiny, whipped, and more extreme forms of violence, including thumbscrews, were used to discipline the Africans. Despite this, Africans did resist. Some committed suicide by jumping overboard or refusing to eat, while others organized insurrections. Although due to the overwhelming weaponry brought to bear by the crew, few attempts at revolt succeeded. The slave trade inflicted severe damage on Africa. The trade of enslaved people created economic incentives for warlords and tribes, leading to an environment of lawlessness and violence. The widespread depopulation and constant fear of being taken captive hindered economic and agricultural growth in many parts of Western Africa. Typically, the European enslavers would abandon individuals who were elderly, disabled, or in a state of dependence. In the Americas, surviving slaves were sold at a market similar to the way poachers sell cattle. In the past, some individuals who owned slaves would mark their new acquisitions on their faces, much like they would with livestock. Why did the Atlantic slave trade end? Despite the growing volume of the trade and the increasing demand for slaves, the transatlantic slave trade was abolished during the first decades of the 19th century due to humanitarian pressures. On the night of 22 to the 23rd of August 1791, men and women, torn from Africa and sold into slavery, revolted against the slave system in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, to obtain freedom and independence. The uprising set forth events that eventually led to the abolition of the slave trade. On the night of 22 to the 23rd of August 1791, men and women, torn from Africa and sold into slavery, revolted against the slave system in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, to obtain freedom and independence. The uprising set forth events that eventually led to the abolition of the slave trade. In 1997, UNESCO established the 23rd of August as International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition, to pay tribute to all those who fought for freedom and to continue teaching about their story and their values. The success of this rebellion, led by the slaves themselves, is a deep source of inspiration today for the fight against all forms of servitude, racism, prejudice, racial discrimination, and social injustice that are a legacy of slavery. The end of the transatlantic slave trade marked a significant milestone in the fight against slavery. But it's important to note, slavery itself continued in various forms in many parts of the world. the struggle for full emancipation and civil rights for African descendants would continue well into the 20th century and remains an ongoing endeavor in the fight for equality and justice. The transatlantic slave trade is a somber reminder of the dark chapters in human history and serves as a stark warning against the horrors of racism, exploitation, and dehumanization. It is important to remember and learn from this history to work towards a more just and equitable future. Overall, learning about African slavery is essential for a well-rounded understanding of history and a more inclusive and compassionate world. Share your thoughts in the comment section below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.